It can be said, with no hint of exaggeration, that Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11, the so-called Christ hymn, is one of the most important passages in the New Testament for understanding early devotion to Jesus. For that reason, though, it is also the most debated text when it comes to early Christology, because everything about this passage, everything is disputed. There are disputes about its genre, about its source, about its religious background, about its structure, debates about the meaning of individual words and phrases. There's a debate whether the main point is ethical, the virtue of humility, or whether the main point is Christological, that Jesus is divine. And if the main point is Christological, well, what is actually being said? What is being asserted about Christ in this text? So that's what I mean when I say this is a heavily disputed passage, and yet it's so important for understanding early Christology. This is why the bibliography for this passage is immense, as there is an endless array of articles, essays, and monographs written about every aspect, small and large, of the text we have before us in Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11. And that is why it's definitely worth exploring as we consider our own journey, our own discussion, our own travels into the world of early devotion to Jesus. Hi, I'm Mike Bird, and in the coming episodes of the Nazareth, Nicaea podcast and vodcast, we're going to slowly grind our way through the many questions and debates associated with Philippians 2, 6 to 11 and what it says about early Christology. Now, I don't think we're going to reach a definitive answer to all of the questions and all of the debates, but hopefully you'll know what the big topics are that are being discussed. And along the way, I'll try proffer a few suggestions as to what I think the answer is. But in this particular video, we're going to start out with two specific questions. We're going to look at the debates about the genre and the sources of this text, this Christological text, Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11.
Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ is Lord.
Now, what you just heard there was Philippians 2 elegantly set to music by Årstein Music Ministry. You can check out their YouTube page. They produce some great stuff. And it's a wonderful listen. You can hear the rhythmic words being sung so wonderfully, so beautifully. But is it the case that Philippians 2, 6 to 11, is it really a hymn? Is it really intended to be sung? Now, we know that the early Christians did sing hymns. They did sing songs of devotion and praise to Christ. In fact, Pliny the Younger, when he was in Bithynia, when he was interviewing and interrogating slaves, he found out that they would sing hymns to Christ as to a god. So we know Christians in the first centuries were singing to Christ as a divine being. They were singing these songs of praise to him. But the question is Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11, is this a Christ hymn? Because I have to tell you, in scholarship, it's overwhelmingly called the Philippian Christ hymn. I mean, I've called it that when I've been writing on it. My friend and I, Nijay Gupta, we refer to it as the kind of Christ hymn in our own commentary on Philippians. And it's easy to see the attraction. It's got a wonderful rhythmic quality, and it is possible, as you just heard, to set it to music in English, and it sounds so beautiful and so wonderful to listen to. But maybe scholars have been a little bit too quick to assume that this text, this passage, is in fact a hymn. Michael Papard, a scholar of early Christianity, he points out that many people, many researchers have largely assumed that this text is a hymn and then pointed out how the language is appropriate for a hymn. So it becomes a kind of piece of self-fulfilling research if you assume it's a hymn and then you say, oh wow, it's a hymn, and look how wonderful and appropriate it is for this language to be used in a hymnic way. Now, the reason that doesn't work is because the parallelism you find in the text, the figurative language, that does not necessarily make something a hymn. That could be a piece of prose, it can just be very elegant writing, if you like. And even though it has a certain rhythm is not the main criteria for making something a hymn. In the ancient world, what made something a hymn or a poem was not rhythm, it was an explicit type of meter. That was the kind of giveaway you got when something was a poem or actually intended as a hymn. You see, a better methodology would be to go back and look at ancient hymns in antiquity, the way people sang hymns to Zeus or Jupiter or Heracles or Asclepius or something along those lines, and then to see what are the distinctive features of ancient hymnody and to see if those features are then present in the text of Philippians 2. Now, when you do the exploration that way, we have to say that the Philippian Christ passage, it lacks many of the features of ancient religious hymnody. There's no invocation, there's no praise, and there's no prayer at the end. And I would also add, it didn't really become a bit of a thing to call this the Philippian Christ hymn until you get into the 20th century. If the Philippians Christ passage is not a hymn, as classically understood, then what type of passage is it? What type of style is it? What genre is it? A number of scholars have argued that it's not a hymn, it's a type of rhetoric. It's a particular species of rhetoric known as epidictic. Epidictic rhetoric is where an author or a speaker would praise a certain person, praise a certain virtue or a certain city, or they would praise a deity or a certain aspect of a deity's being or attributes that are worthy of adulation and devotion. So perhaps what we have here is not a hymn, it's a type of prose hymn, a very poetic way of eulogizing or valorizing Jesus as one who is a heavenly being, who became human, was exalted in heaven, and is certainly worthy of divine acclamation. So while Christians, I think, did sing hymns to Christ as to a God, as Pliny said, I don't think Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11 is actually a hymn. It's more like a type of poetic prose that celebrates, that lauds Jesus as a model of humility and the one who is exalted to a position of extraordinary proximity to God the Father. What then about the origins of the Philippians Christ passage? Where did it come from? Well, one scholar, Giza Vermesh, he pointed out that the language is very Un-Pauline. Therefore, he thinks it's an interpolation into the text sometime in the 2nd century. That's one perspective, not one that's got a lot of traction or a lot of assent. But others have kind of shared a similar perspective in saying that the language is Un-Pauline, like Ernst Lohmeyer in the early 20th century. He said the language is not typical of Paul, therefore it's an earlier text or an earlier piece of traditional material that Paul has revised and incorporated into his letter at this juncture. Other scholars have said, well, is it really Un-Pauline? I mean, what if it is a Pauline composition? What if it is something that Paul, maybe in collaboration with his co-workers, has written down as they're writing this wonderful letter to the Philippians? This is a view shared by a large number of scholars, in particular Gordon Fee, N.T. Wright. In fact, N.T. Wright says this. He says, but if someone were to take it upon themselves to argue on the basis of my conclusions that the hymn was originally by Paul himself, I should find it hard to produce convincing counter-arguments. So maybe it is a Pauline composition. And then there's Hans-Dieter Betz, who's argued that, yes, it is a Pauline composition, but it's an early composition, which is to say it is something that Paul himself composed early on in his apostolic career, and it's his verbal response to seeing the glorious and risen Lord as recounted in 2 Corinthians 4:5. So Paul had this amazing appearance of Jesus to him, his famous Christophany on the road to Damascus. And the Christ passage is Paul verbalizing, explaining what happened in that experience when he had this dynamic and very arresting encounter with the Lordship of Jesus Christ. So what do we think then about the source for this Christ passage? Is it an interpolation? Is it a pre-Pauline text? Is it an early Pauline text? Or is it just a plain, bland Pauline text, something that Paul himself has composed? Well, I have to say this kind of is a tricky one. On the one hand, this Christ passage, it is something of a thesis for the letter. I mean, Paul is going to talk a lot about the topic of imitation, of humility, and setting aside one's own privileges to serve God. In other words, the type of things that you find in Philippians 2, 6-11, that appears elsewhere in the letter, not least in chapter 3. And that's why some scholars think that this really is something written by Paul. And on top of that, you could say some of the language does appear elsewhere, such as, when Paul says he was made in human likeness. Well, that's kind of similar to Romans 8, where Jesus appeared in the likeness of sinful flesh. So for all the claims that it's a pre-Pauline or Un-Pauline text, a lot of it fits very snugly into the context of Philippians, and a lot of it also is conducive to the phrasing and terminology of the wider Pauline corpus. But on the other hand, we could note a few other facts that may tip us over the edge of thinking that this is a piece of traditional material. First and foremost, we have to say that there is a lot of phrasing here that is very unique. There's a lot of words that are used here and are found nowhere else in Paul's writings or nowhere else in the New Testament, such as the word harpagmos, that means snatching or seizing. And then there's katakrinion, meaning lower depths. They're found only here, nowhere else in Paul's writings. And then you've got phrases like equal with God or emptied himself. That's not normally the way that Paul describes Jesus. We could also add that kicking off with a relative pronoun, while it does not prove that this is traditional material, it would certainly be conducive to it being a piece of traditional material, similar to what you find in other places like Romans 4:25, Colossians 1:15-20, 1 Timothy 3:16, where scholars suspect that we're dealing with some very carefully crafted primitive materials that have been inserted into the text. And this passage does have a poetic and rhythmic quality. It's got alliteration and assonance, which suggests a deliberate composition rather than something that's necessarily been written on the fly by Paul. So I suspect that this text is something either written by someone in Paul's circle, or else it's a piece of Christological poetry that Paul has inherited and inserted into this part of Philippians because it really does mesh with his main point, talking about giving up one's own privileges and embodying the virtue of humility that Christ himself demonstrates in his own divestment of his various privileges and prerogatives as the divine being so he could become a slave who serves. It's a hard call, but I would lean towards the view that this is either early Pauline or pre-Pauline. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that this text really is pre-Pauline. If that is the case, where did this passage, where did this Christ poem come from? What was shaping it? What was influencing? What was the background out of which someone would compose a piece of Christological poetry like this one? Well, as you can imagine, there's a number of very specific proposals. Some argue that this passage emerges out of the same stream of thought that imagines divine beings metamorphosizing and becoming human and then returning to heaven, something you might associate with Zeus, or maybe a figure like Heracles or something along those lines. Others see here some echoes and allusions to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, a mysterious figure who dies a horrible death, the death of a slave, and is then vindicated and sees the light of life. And then there are others who see a kind of counterpart to the story of Adam. I mean, Adam was in the image of God. He wanted to attain likeness with God, so he literally snatched after some forbidden fruit in order to do that. Whereas Christ is the opposite. Although he's in the form of God, he did not snatch after equality with God. He was obedient to the point of death on the cross. That would be underscoring that Christ is a type of new Adam. And then others think that what we have here is a kind of contrast with the imperial cult, because the Roman emperor could be praised and worshipped as Lord. He could be worshipped as one who is equal to the Olympian god. So maybe what we have here is a counterpart to the imperial cult within the Roman Empire. Now, we cannot be certain, but my own guesstimate, my own polite speculation is that this is a piece of Christological poetry that emerged from Greek-speaking Jewish Christians, maybe sometime in the early 40s, maybe somewhere like Antioch or Caesarea. I can't rule out that it's maybe based on an underlying composition, but at the same time, you can't exactly prove it either. I think the purpose of this Christ poem is to praise Jesus as Lord over and against another Lord who claimed to be equal with God, one before whom many knees had bowed. That was namely Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or as you probably know him as, Caligula. We know Caligula was very keen on his divine honors. That becomes evident in several sources, not least as Philo of Alexandria, who writes about this extensively. We also know from evidence on the island of Miletus that Caligula was intending to build a major temple to himself. More pointedly, it was in AD 40 that Caligula had a big spat with the Jews of Judea and in Alexandria with their failure to worship him, and also a few Judean hotheads had torn down altars that people had built to worship Caligula, which really ticked him off. Consequently, Caligula wanted to turn the Jerusalem temple into a temple to Zeus Epiphanes, with himself cast in the mold of, you guessed it, Zeus. Now, we do need a little bit of background to this because, obviously Caligula wanting to set up his own statue, his own temple to Zeus in Jerusalem was going to cheese people off a lot. I mean, really a lot. But there was some precedent for this because in the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he desecrated the Jerusalem temple. He stuck in there some pagan idols, and he had himself declared to be equal with God. That's the claim that's made about him in the Maccabean literature. And that would mean that Caligula's demand for divine worship from the Judeans and wanting to turn the Jerusalem temple into effectively a pagan temple, that's rehashing a very painful memory in Judean history. The other thing we want to note as part of the background there is that in Greek and Roman religion, offering someone worship equal to the gods was one of the highest honors you could give a emperor, king, or a benefactor. It was one of the greatest ways, or one of the greatest honors you could bestow on someone was to give them worship equal to the gods, particularly equal to the Olympian gods. Now, if something like that is the context in which some Christians, Greek-speaking Christians in the early 40s were writing this Christ poem, then what they would be saying is that Jesus is not like the Emperor Caligula, someone who rapaciously seized after equality with God, like a self-aggrandizing ruler, demanding divine honors, demanding divine worship. What the Christ poem would be saying is that there is a big contrast between Caligula and Christ. Christ is the one who had all the glory, who had all the honor, who had all of that, and yet voluntarily emptied himself, surrendered himself into human slavery to the point of dying a slave's death. And out of that, he was then exalted to a superlative position, and he's declared to be Lord by divine acclamation. Not by supplicants, not by slaves, not by soldiers, not by the Senate. And what is truly stunning is that this Christ poem then uses the monotheistic rhetoric of Isaiah 45 and applies it to Jesus. The God who will not share his name with any other is now sharing his own name, his own lordship with the exalted Jesus. So what I like to imagine, something I will call plausible speculation, is that we might have a group of Greek-speaking Jewish Christians, maybe in somewhere like Caesarea or Antioch or Damascus, composing this poem in praise of Jesus, to herald Jesus as a divine being who was already equal with God and yet chose instead to become a servant, and who was then exalted and acclaimed with a status ordinarily reserved for Yahweh. And they're doing that in particular over and against the particular claims, the particular propaganda, and the particular demands for divine worship that the Roman Emperor Caligula was making for himself. So then, what have we learnt so far about the Philippians Christ passage, Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11? Well, we've covered several things. We began off looking at the debates about genre. And although it's widely assumed that this is a hymn, often called the Christ hymn, we've seen that's not necessarily the case. It's more likely a piece of encomiastic prose. We could call it maybe a prose hymn. Certainly, it praises Christ, it eulogizes him, it valorizes him, but it may not be a hymn in the technical sense. We've also been through the discussion of its sources. Is it Pauline, or is it early Pauline, or is it pre-Pauline? I certainly lean towards the view that it is pre-Pauline, but I would not be surprised if it turns out in the end that it really is a Pauline composition. But for the time being, my working hypothesis is that this is a piece of pre-Pauline tradition that Paul himself has incorporated into the letter. Now, if it is a piece of pre-Pauline material, then where did it come from? And this is where I tried to offer a conjecture that maybe it emerged, this Christ poem emerged, in the context of Greek-speaking Jewish Christians, sometimes in the early 40s, praising Christ as the exalted Lord, the servant king, if you were, who can be marked out in direct contrast to the claims and the demand for divine honors that were made by the Roman Emperor Caligula. So that, in a nutshell, is what we've covered in this episode. In the next episode, we're going to continue our exploration of the Philippian Christ passage, the Christ poem, as we'll call it from here on in. And we're going to look at several things. We're going to look at that phrase, the form of God. What does that mean? We're going to do an extended word study on the Greek word harpagmos. And then we're going to look at the religious background of the phrase equal with God. So if you don't want to miss out on that, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, leave a comment or question, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Nazareth to Nicaea.